The rain fell in sheets, a cold, relentless downpour that made the drive to the Whitlock estate feel like a journey to another world. Emily tightened her scarf as she hurried up the slick cobblestone steps. The mansion loomed above her, its Gothic spires cutting into the stormy sky like the teeth of a predator. Every instinct told her to turn back, but desperation held her firm. She needed inspiration, something, anything, to pull her from the creative slump that threatened to ruin her burgeoning art career. Inside, the air was warmer, but no less oppressive. The auction hall was dimly lit, a cavernous room filled with relics of the past. Chandeliers hung like skeletal remains, their glass teardrops casting fractured reflections across the walls. The faint scent of mildew clung to the heavy curtains and wooden beams, mingling with the metallic tang of wet coats. The murmurs of the crowd seemed swallowed by the room's vastness. Emily wandered past displays of antiques, cracked porcelain dolls with glassy stares, oil paintings darkened by time, and gilded furniture worn by the weight of history. She was beginning to regret coming. Nothing spoke to her. Nothing sparked the fire she so desperately needed. Then she saw it. The Cupid statue was tucked away on a pedestal near the back of the hall, almost as if it didn't want to be noticed. It stood about 2 feet tall, carved from pale marble that gleamed unnaturally, even in the dim light. The craftsmanship was impeccable. Every curve of the cherub's form was lifelike, its chubby cheeks frozen in a mischievous grin. Its tiny fingers clutched a quiver of arrows, each tipped with a razor-sharp gleam that seemed out of place for such a whimsical figure. But its eyes, they were what drew Emily in. The sculptor had carved them with a precision that bordered on obsession. They seemed to glint with intelligence, almost as if they were watching her. A low voice broke her trance. Ah, an excellent choice. Emily turned to see the auctioneer, a man whose face was as weathered as the relics around them. His thin smile didn't reach his eyes, which gleamed with something she couldn't quite place. Amusement? Pity? It's beautiful, Emily said, unable to tear her gaze away from the statue. Indeed, the auctioneer replied, his voice carrying a hint of warning. But beware, miss, the Cupid comes with a history, and not a pleasant one. Cursed, they say. Love twisted into torment. Many have owned it, but few have kept it long. Emily chuckled nervously. You tell that story to everyone? Only to those who look too closely, he murmured before disappearing into the crowd. The bidding was fierce, but Emily refused to back down. When the gavel finally struck, the Cupid was hers. She felt a strange elation as she carried it to her car, though the rain slicking its marble surface made it feel heavier than it should have. As she drove home, the storm seemed to intensify, thunder rumbling like distant laughter. That night, as she placed the Cupid on a small table in her living room, its grin seemed sharper, more knowing. Shadows danced across its face, stretching its features into something almost sinister. Emily shook off the feeling and went to bed, but sleep did not come easily. The statue's image lingered in her mind, and when she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with whispers she could not understand. The first incident happened the following morning. Emily was sipping coffee, staring blankly at her easel, when her phone buzzed. It was a message from her art rival, Claire. They had competed for years, and though Emily tried to be civil, she couldn't deny the sting of Claire's recent success. The message was simple, a photograph of Claire's latest painting, vibrant and hauntingly beautiful, accompanied by a caption. Finished last night. Hope to see it hanging soon. Emily's chest tightened with envy as she stared at the photo. She glanced at the Cupid statue, its grin almost mocking. You'd do better, she muttered under her breath, setting her phone aside. By noon, the news arrived. Claire had been hospitalized, An inexplicable illness had struck her down. Emily froze, the coffee mug slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. The timing was too perfect, too sharp to be a coincidence. The Cupid's cold eyes seemed to glint in the light. Shaking her head, she told herself it was absurd. "It's just an old statue," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Still, unease crept in. She avoided the Cupid for the rest of the day, retreating to her studio in an attempt to distract herself. That evening, the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely more than the rustling of leaves outside her window. But as the hours wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. Words Emily couldn't understand seemed to weave themselves into the air, curling around her ears like smoke. She pressed her hands to her head, but it didn't help. Finally, she stormed into the living room, her breath catching as her eyes fell on the Cupid. The whispers stopped. Its arrows gleamed in the dim light, their sharp tips catching the glow of her desk lamp. She swore one of them had moved, but when she blinked, the quiver was still. The statue's grin, however, seemed wider than before, its eyes almost alight with triumph. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Anyone who crossed Emily's mind with even a trace of bitterness or resentment met with misfortune. A gallery owner who had rejected her work broke his wrist in a freak accident. An old flame she still resented for breaking her heart lost his job under mysterious circumstances. Each time, the Cupid's presence felt heavier, its grin sharper, its arrows more gleaming. Emily began to dread the statue. She tried moving it to a closet, covering it with a sheet, even facing it toward the wall. But no matter what she did, the whispers returned, the statue's oppressive energy seeping into every corner of her apartment. One night she woke to find it back on the table, its arrows pointing directly at her bed. Her scream echoed in the stillness, but the Cupid did not move. Its grin promised only torment, its arrows poised to strike again. The whispers became a nightly torment, winding through Emily's apartment like a ghostly wind. Her once cozy space now felt cold and alien, the walls oppressive and tight. Every glance at the Cupid statue filled her with dread. She couldn't bring herself to touch it anymore, even to hide it. The mere thought of moving it sent a cold shiver down her spine. Determined to end the madness, Emily dove into research. She spent hours online, combing through obscure forms and auction records, tracing the statue's path through history. Each fragment she uncovered painted a darker picture. The Cupid had been sculpted in the 18th century by a reclusive artist named Laurent Duval, a man whose life had been consumed by heartbreak. According to one source, Duval had been betrayed by his lover, who had used him to climb the social ladder before abandoning him. In his despair, Duval turned to dark practices, imbuing his art with his rage and sorrow. The Cupid, his final masterpiece, was said to carry his curse, a vessel of torment for anyone who dared to love or envy. Emily stared at the black and white sketch of Duval she found online. His sunken eyes and gaunt face seemed familiar, like a ghost lingering just out of reach. As she scrolled, her breath caught. A faint watermark in the corner of one image. Whitlock Estate Archives. The connection sent a chill racing through her. The Cupid had come full circle, returning to the very place it was first sold. But why? And why had she, of all people, been drawn to it? As she delved deeper, Emily discovered a pattern. The Cupid had left ruin in its wake for centuries. Owners succumbed to madness, their lives unraveling in fits of paranoia, bitterness, and despair. Those closest to them suffered equally. A scorned widow in Paris, an aristocrat who lost his fortune, a painter who burned his own gallery. Every story ended in disaster. The realization made Emily's skin crawl. She wasn't just a victim, she was a conduit. Her envy, Her regrets, her deepest wounds, everything she tried to suppress, was feeding the statue. The Cupid's grin seemed sharper when she looked at it now, as if it knew. That night she dreamed of Laurent Duval. He stood in her apartment, a shadowy figure hunched over the Cupid, his gaunt face twisted with rage. His hands moved feverishly as he carved the statue, his whispers echoing in her ears. Love is pain. Love is vengeance. When she woke, the statue was beside her bed. Emily turned to the only person she trusted, her friend Anne. Over coffee, she laid everything bare, the words spilling out in a rush of fear and desperation. Anne listened, her brows furrowing deeper with each passing minute. "You've been under a lot of stress," Anne said gently. "This obsession with the statue might be your mind's way of processing it. Let me help you." "Anne, it's real, I swear," Emily pleaded, gripping her friend's hand. "Every time I think of someone, if I even feel a hint of resentment, something horrible happens to them." Anne's expression softened, her skepticism clear but unspoken. "Let's go to a museum or a university. There are experts who can tell us what's really going on." Emily wanted to believe Anne's calm logic, but when she returned home, the Cupid's presence felt heavier, its arrows gleaming like polished blades. That night, Anne's car slid off the road during a freak rainstorm. She survived, but her injuries left her hospitalized. The Cupid's arrows pointed toward Emily's desk now, a silent accusation. Emily couldn't let another person suffer. The guilt gnawed at her, sharper than the whispers that haunted her every waking moment. She remembered the auctioneer's cryptic warning and decided to confront him, hoping he held answers. The Whitlock estate was closed for renovations, but Emily forced her way in, flashlight in hand. The grand hall felt different without the chatter of bidders. It was hollow and cold, the air thick with a sense of abandonment. She found the auctioneer in a back room, poring over dusty ledgers. His expression turned grim as she placed the Cupid on the table between them. "You should have left it alone," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "What do I do?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. "It's destroying everything, everyone I care about." The man hesitated, his hands trembling as he lit a candle. "There is only one way to break the curse. You must sever its connection to the emotions it feeds on. But the process, it is not without cost." He explained a ritual, one designed to unbind the Cupid's power by confronting the darkest parts of herself. The ritual required a blood offering, her own pain, symbolized by piercing her heart with one of the Cupid's arrows. The act would sever the curse's link to her, but it carried a risk. If her resolve faltered, the Cupid would consume her entirely. Emily returned home, the instructions echoing in her mind. She set up the ritual in her studio, lighting candles around the Cupid. The statue seemed to pulse with anticipation, its grin wider than ever. As she held an arrow over her chest, the whispers grew deafening, voices rising in a cacophony of fear, anger, and despair. Shadows flickered along the walls, coiling like smoke. The Cupid seemed alive now, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she pressed the arrow to her chest. The tip bit into her skin, sending a jolt of searing pain through her. The whispers turned to screams, and the room blurred as the shadows surged toward her. But she didn't stop. With a guttural scream, she plunged the arrow deeper, embracing the agony. The world exploded into darkness, the whispers vanishing as suddenly as they had begun. When Emily awoke, the Cupid was gone. Only its shattered remains lay scattered across the floor. The air in her apartment felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. But the scars on her chest remained, a grim reminder of the curse she had broken and the darkness she had confronted within herself. Emily stared at the single unbroken arrow lying among the rubble. It gleamed faintly, a quiet promise that the curse was not entirely vanquished. Emily's apartment was eerily silent in the aftermath. The oppressive whispers were gone, the shadows no longer danced with malice, and the suffocating weight that had pressed on her chest had lifted. Yet the silence felt wrong, too complete, as if the apartment itself were holding its breath. She stood amidst the shattered remains of the Cupid statue, her hands trembling as she stared at the single unbroken arrow. Its surface gleamed faintly in the dim light, an unnatural luminescence that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. Emily wanted to look away, to sweep the arrow into the trash and forget it ever existed, but something about it rooted her in place. It was as if it were watching her, waiting. Blood still seeped slowly from the wound over her chest where the arrow had pierced her during the ritual. The pain was sharp and raw, but it was nothing compared to the strange emptiness gnawing at her core. She had succeeded in breaking the curse, or so she thought. The Cupid statue was destroyed, and its malevolent whispers had been silenced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the ordeal wasn't over. Emily knelt to gather the statue's fragments. The marble was unnaturally cold, sending chills up her fingertips. One piece still bore the remnants of the Cupid's mischievous grin, now frozen in a jagged, broken sneer. She shuddered, wrapping the shards in a cloth and tossing them into a trash bag. She left the arrow for last. Its presence filled the room, its faint glow intensifying the longer she stared. When she finally reached out to pick it up, her breath hitched. The instant her fingers brushed the shaft, a jolt of cold pierced her, and a faint echo of whispers stirred at the edge of her hearing. "No," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, clawing their way into her mind. The apartment's shadows deepened unnaturally, crawling up the walls like living things. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as though the building itself was twisting around her. Emily staggered back, clutching her chest. The wound began to throb, the pain blooming like fire beneath her ribs. She glanced toward the mirror across the room and froze. Her reflection didn't match her movements. In the mirror, she was still holding the Cupid arrow, her other hand reaching out as if to beckon someone closer. The reflection's eyes gleamed with a faint, eerie light, a terrible mimicry of the Cupid's own malevolence. Her lips curled into a smile that wasn't hers. "No!" she screamed, backing away. Her reflection didn't move, its grin widening as it clutched the arrow tighter. Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flickered violently, plunging the room into near darkness. The whispers turned to laughter, low and guttural, echoing from every corner. The temperature plummeted, her breath misting in the cold. "You thought it was that simple?" a voice hissed, distorted and layered as though spoken by 1,000 mouths. Emily turned toward the sound, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows coalesced in the center of the room, forming a figure, twisted, almost human, but wrong in its proportions. Its face was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its grin was unmistakable. "Duval," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally fluid. "You shattered the vessel," it said, the voice reverberating inside her skull. "But the curse lives on. You carry it now, in your heart, in your soul." Emily clutched the arrow tighter, her knuckles white. "No, I ended this. I faced it." "Did you?" The figure tilted its head, mockery in its tone. "Or did you only make yourself its new host?" Her breath came in short gasps as the truth settled over her like a shroud. The ritual hadn't destroyed the curse, it had transferred it. The Cupid's torment was no longer bound to marble, it was bound to her. The figure melted into the shadows, its final words lingering in the air like smoke. "Love is pain, love is vengeance, and now you are its herald." The whispers faded, and the apartment returned to its still, unnatural quiet. Emily stood frozen, the arrow burning cold in her hand. The grin in the mirror was gone, replaced with her own haunted expression. But she knew the truth. She would never be alone again. Somewhere deep inside, a faint voice laughed, its malice seeping into the edges of her mind. The arrow pulsed once in her hand, its glow a quiet, ominous reminder that the curse was far from over.